A narrow street at dusk, dimly lit by flickering lamps, where shadows stretched longer than the people who cast them, and movement felt slightly delayed, as if the world itself were not entirely synchronized with those walking through it. The kind of place where everything appears normal at first glance, yet something subtle begins to feel uncertain the longer one remains, because familiarity does not always reveal truth, and what is repeated often enough begins to feel unquestionable, and the people moving through that street trusted what they saw, what they heard, what they experienced, believing that perception and reality were the same, and that belief held everything together, because without it, nothing feels stable, nothing feels certain, nothing feels safe, and yet something had already begun to shift, not in the street itself, not in the rhythm of footsteps or the quiet hum of distant voices, but in the way it was being observed, because at the edge of that quiet scene stood Friedrich Nietzsche, not participating, not interrupting, but watching, as if what he saw did not fully align with what others believed they were experiencing, and that difference created something subtle, something that could be felt but not, easily explained, a quiet tension that moved through the air without a clear source, and people began to notice it, not directly, not consciously, but enough to feel that something was different, and difference, when it cannot be explained, creates discomfort, and discomfort, when left without explanation, often turns into resistance, and resistance seeks expression, and expression arrived in the form of question, casual at first, almost dismissive, asking what Nietzsche found so unusual in something so ordinary, what exactly he believed he was seeing that others were not, and the question carried a hint of challenge, but also something deeper, something closer to unease, because people do not like the feeling that what they see might not be what they think it is, and Nietzsche did not answer immediately, and that silence created space, and space invites attention, and attention, when sustained, creates pressure, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost attached, and he said that the most dangerous illusion is not what people believe, but what they perceive without question, and the words did not land as an attack. They landed as something more subtle, something that required interpretation, and the people around him reacted not with immediate resistance, but with confusion, because the statement did not align with any clear expectation. And when something does not align, the mind attempts to reshape it into something familiar, and one of the men laughed, lightly at first, dismissing the idea as unnecessary complexity, saying that reality is not something that needs to be questioned, that what people see, hear, and experience is simply what exists, and the laughter spread, not because it was understood, but because it restored comfort, and comfort is what people reach for when something unfamiliar appears, and Nietzsche did not react, did not challenge the laughter, did not defend his statement, and that lack of reaction created something unexpected, because when a man does not respond to dismissal, the dismissal begins to lose its force, and the laughter, though still present, became less stable, less certain, and one of the men stepped forward again, this time more directly, asking what Nietzsche meant, asking whether he was suggesting that reality itself could not be trusted, and Nietzsche looked at him, not with confrontation, but with clarity, and said that people do not experience reality, they interpret it, and the words moved differently this time, because they were more precise, more direct, and the tension that followed was no longer subtle. It was present, visible in the way people slowed, in the way attention narrowed, and something had begun. The movement of the street did not stop, but it changed, becoming less fluid, less certain, as if something had interrupted the rhythm without visibly altering it. And that is what made it unsettling, because disruption does not always appear as chaos. Sometimes appears as hesitation, as a subtle delay between perception and reaction, and the people around him felt it, even if they did not fully understand it, because something had been introduced that did not fit with the structure they relied on, and when something does not fit, the mind attempts to correct it, to dismiss it, to return to what feels familiar, but dismissal requires certainty, and certainty had already begun to weaken, and one of the men spoke again, his voice lower, now less dismissive, asking what Nietzsche meant more precisely, asking whether he was suggesting that people could not trust what they see, what they hear, what they experience, and the question carried resistance, but also something deeper, something closer to unease, because the idea had begun to settle, not as an argument, but as a possibility. And possibilities are far more difficult to reject than statements because they do not require agreement. They simply exist, and Friedrich Nietzsche answered calmly, saying that what people call reality is not what exists, but what they have learned to recognize, shaped by language, by memory, by expectation, by the need to organize experience into something that feels stable, and the words moved through the space differently this time because they did not challenge reality directly. They challenged the way it's constructed, and that shift made the idea more difficult to resist because it did not require disbelief. It required reflection, and reflection is slower, heavier, more difficult to avoid. And Nietzsche continued, saying that perception is not passive, it is active, that the mind does not simply receive the world. It shapes it, selects from it, filters it, and reconstructs it into something that feels coherent. And that coherence is what people trust, not because it is true, but because it is consistent. And consistency creates the illusion of truth. And the people around him felt that idea begin to move through them, not as agreement, but as tension. Because if perception is constructed, then what they call reality is not fixed. And if it is not fixed, then it cannot be fully trusted, and that realization does not settle easily. It creates pressure, and the man who had spoken did not respond immediately. And that hesitation revealed something new, because earlier reactions had been immediate, automatic, but now something had slowed them down, and once thought slows, it deepens, and depth is where discomfort grows, and Nietzsche, seeing this, did not push harder, did not escalate, because the moment had already shifted, and escalation would have broken what had begun to form. And instead, he said that the most unsettling truth is not that reality is false, but that it is incomplete, and what people experience is only a fraction of what exists, shaped into something that feels whole. And the words settled into the space with quiet weight, because they did not demand reaction, they demanded recognition, and recognition, once it begins, cannot be easily undone. And the street, once felt as stable, now held something else entirely, something uncertain, something unresolved, something that no longer responded to simple trust. And within that shift, something had already begun to break, because what they were feeling was not confusion. It was something far more unsettling, a quiet awareness that what they had always trusted might not have been complete. And for the first time, certainty did not feel as solid as it once had. The street did not change. The lamp still flickered. The people still moved. But none of it felt the same. Because something had shifted, not in what existed, but in how it was being understood. And that difference was enough to alter everything. Because once a person begins to question the nature of what they perceive, they cannot fully return to the certainty they once had. And the people around them felt it, even if they could not fully explain it. Because something had been introduced that did not require agreement to exist. Something that had already begun to alter the way they experienced the world. And that alteration is what makes an idea dangerous. Not because it forces change, but because it makes change unavoidable. And Friedrich Nietzsche stood within that shifting space, not as someone who had altered reality, but as someone who had revealed its instability. And one of the men spoke again, his voice quieter now, asking how a person could live if reality itself could not be fully trusted. And the question carried something new, not resistance, but fear. And fear is always more honest than certainty, because it appears when something fundamental begins to weaken. And Nietzsche answered calmly, saying that people do not need reality to be absolute. They only need it to feel stable. And that stability is what the mind creates, not what the world provides. And the words did not comfort. They deepened the tension, because they removed the idea of certainty and replaced it with something far more difficult to accept, the responsibility of interpretation. And the people around him fell silent, not because they agreed, but because something within them had already shifted, something that could not be undone through denial alone. And Nietzsche spoke once more, saying that the most dangerous illusion is not false belief, but unquestioned perception, because once a person stops questioning what they see, they stop questioning everything else. And the words settled into the space with finality, not as an argument, but as something that could not be easily dismissed. And no one responded, because there was no response that could restore what had been there before. And Nietzsche turned and walked away, his presence fading into the same street that now felt unfamiliar. And as he disappeared, the people remained, but they were no longer the same. Because once a person begins to question reality itself, they cannot fully return to the comfort of certainty. And what remained was not silence, but something far more unsettling, the quiet awareness that what they had always trusted was not wrong, but incomplete. And that awareness does not leave easily. The street did not change. The lamp still flickered. The people still moved. But none of it felt the same.